The coins hit the conveyor belt before the apology did. 3 of them, a quarter, a dime, a nickel, each one landing with a different pitch against the hard plastic surface of the checkout lane. High, sharp, then lower, then the flat and final sound of the nickel tumbling to a stop against the basket's dark edge. The sound traveled across 6 feet of grocery store air and registered in Zion Beaumont's chest before it registered anywhere else, because that is how the body works when it has been trained, by necessity, to receive the world through every channel available to it except the obvious one.
He was standing fourth in line. There were 3 people between him and the register. A woman ahead of him smelled like lavender detergent and had the faint mechanical breathing pattern of someone with mild anxiety. Short inhales, held half a beat too long, released quietly through the nose. In front of her, a man in what sounded like rubber-soled work boots who had not moved in 4 minutes. And directly ahead of that man, at the register itself, the person Zion had been tracking since the moment the air in the checkout lane shifted. Because air shifts when certain people enter a space. Most people walk into a room the way water fills a container. They take the shape of whatever's already there. But every once in a while, a person walks in and the room rearranges itself around them without anyone deciding to let it. The fluorescent lights above Harmon's Fresh Market still buzzed at their same flat, institutional frequency. The conveyor belt still moved at its same automated pace. The cashier, a young woman, early 20s, the kind of nervous energy that announced itself through the frequency of small sounds, the shift of sneakers on linoleum, the soft click of her fingernail against the register screen, still scanned items with the same mechanical rhythm. But something about the man at the front of the line had changed the temperature of the whole interaction the moment he stepped into it.
I noticed it all. I notice everything. That is both the gift and the punishment of moving through a world that was never built with me in mind. My name is Zion Beaumont, and I have been blind since I was 4 years old, which means I have spent 24 years learning to read the world through the parts of it that other people never bother paying attention to. Sound, temperature, air pressure changes when bodies lean toward or away. The minute shift in a person's vocal register when they are choosing a word carefully. The way a room holds silence differently depending on who is standing in it. I was at Harmon's Fresh Market on a Wednesday afternoon holding a basket with 6 items in it. A jar of almond butter, 2 cans of black beans, a bunch of bananas I had checked twice by touch, a box of jasmine rice, and a bar of the dark chocolate I allowed myself once a week. And I had already identified 3 things about the man at the register before he opened his mouth. He was tall. He was tense in the very specific way of a person who was accustomed to never being tense. And whatever was about to come out of his mouth next, it was not going to be the truth. "I'm sorry," the man said. His voice was low and even, carrying the careful, measured flatness of someone who had been trained, consciously or by long habit, to never let a sentence do more than it needed to do. No extra weight, no uptick at the end, no reaching. "I think I forgot my wallet." I stood very still. That voice did not belong to a man who forgot things. The cashier made the small sounds of a person trying to smooth something over. "Oh, it's okay. That happens. We can absolutely hold your order at the customer service desk. It's no problem at all." She was speeding up. The reassurance was for herself as much as him. "I'll cover it," Zion said. He hadn't planned to say it. The words arrived before the decision did, the way things do when your instincts have been sharpened by years of needing them to be faster than your second thoughts. The woman with the lavender detergent turned to look at him. He felt the shift of her body. The man in the work boots ahead of her went still. The cashier stopped mid-sentence. And the man at the register, the tall, tense, deliberately calm man who did not forget things, went completely and absolutely quiet. Zion moved forward. His right hand found the edge of the conveyor rail the way it always did, index finger trailing lightly along the metal, giving him the line of the space. He located the card reader by the soft electronic standby hum it put out. Every card reader in every grocery store in this country hums at approximately the same pitch when it's waiting, a fact that Zion had cataloged years ago and never had reason to forget. He tapped his card. The machine gave its approval beep. "Transaction complete." "Oh my gosh. Thank you so much, sir." The cashier exhaled the words like she'd been holding them. "It's fine," Zion said quietly. But it wasn't fine, and he knew it, and the man ahead of him knew it, and the specific quality of the silence between them in that moment was the kind that only existed when two people were both aware that something had just happened that neither of them had fully planned for. The man hadn't moved toward his bags, hadn't offered thanks, hadn't turned toward the exit. He was standing precisely where he had been standing, and the air around him carried the faint warmth of cedar wood and something clean and faintly mineral, like cold stone, and Zion stood close enough to him now that he could hear the man breathing, slow, deliberate, controlled breathing, the breathing of a man who was processing something. Zion turned his head at a measured angle toward the man's position. Not looking. He never looked. But orienting the way a compass orients, not by choosing a direction but by responding to something magnetic. "You don't have to pretend to forget something," Zion said, his voice low enough that only the man could hear it. "To measure someone." The conveyor belt stopped moving. The cashier stopped reaching for bags. The woman with the lavender detergent made a sound that was almost a breath, not quite a word. The man at the front of the line did not speak. But the breath he pulled in, drawn slowly through the nose, held for exactly 2 beats, released in perfect control, was not the breath of a man who had been caught doing something wrong. It was not embarrassment. It was not guilt. It was something closer to recognition. The specific, quiet recognition of a person who has been looking for something for a long time and has just found it somewhere they did not entirely expect to find it. And Zion stood at the register in Harmon's Fresh Market with a receipt printing out in front of him and the absolute certain knowledge that this moment, this specific intersection of a man pretending to forget and a blind man pretending not to notice, was not an accident. It was not coincidence. It was the beginning of something that had been set in motion before he arrived, by someone who had known exactly what they were doing. He just didn't know yet what they had been looking for. Hi viewers. I have to ask you something before we go any further. If you were standing in that checkout line and you could feel that the whole situation was staged, would you have said something? Or would you have just paid and walked away? I need to know. Drop it in the comments right now because the answer changes everything about who Zion is. But that wasn't where this started. The door handle on the compliance meeting room was brushed steel and positioned 4 inches lower than every other handle on the floor. Zion's hand found it on the first sweep, and he stopped walking for exactly 1 second. Not because the handle surprised him, but because it confirmed something he had suspected since the elevator ride up. Someone had modified this room. Someone had read a checklist that said accessible door handle height and made one adjustment to one door and considered the job done, the way people who have never thought about a problem solve it, by addressing the most visible symptom and calling it a solution. It was the same as the braille on the 12th floor that had been mounted upside down. The same as the audio announcement system in the lobby that described floor numbers in a voice so distorted by echo it was functionally useless. The same as every carefully labeled, thoughtfully badged, prominently featured accessibility initiative he had ever encountered in a corporate space, gestures that were designed to be seen rather than used.
I grew up in a house where everything had a label. My mother's handwriting in thick black marker on the edges of the Tupperware, on the bathroom cabinets, on each drawer in the kitchen. She meant it as love. She did mean it as love, and I understood that even as a child, which made it harder rather than easier to explain why it hurt. Because the labels were not for me. A blind child does not read marker on a drawer. The labels were for her. A way of making the effort visible. A way of proving to herself and to anyone who looked that she was doing everything right, that she had accounted for her child's condition, that nothing had been left unconsidered. What the labels actually communicated, in a language that lives beneath language, was this: you are a problem that could be solved with enough preparation. And I was not a problem. I was a person. Those are different things, and not enough people understand the distance between them. I was the only blind child in a family that had never needed to think about blindness before I arrived in it. My uncle Darnell, who had arranged today's meeting with the best intentions and the worst understanding of what I actually needed from him, had spent the last 6 years negotiating my presence in rooms the way you negotiate a complicated contract, always with the other party's comfort in mind. He did not do this maliciously. He did it because he loved me and because he had been taught somewhere along the way that taking up space on behalf of a disabled family member was the same as advocacy. It wasn't. Advocacy would have been asking me what I wanted before he made the call.
Zion kept walking. His uncle Darnell was somewhere ahead of him in the hallway, talking to someone in the carefully projected baritone he used in professional settings, the one that said "I belong here" without ever having to say it out loud. The hallway itself was wide enough, Zion noted, for 2 wheelchairs to move side by side, which was the minimum legal standard. But it was interrupted every 30 feet by a large decorative planter that had no floor indicator, no textural warning on the tile, nothing to tell a person navigating by cane that an obstacle was about to appear in the center of an otherwise clear path. One of them had caught him in the shin 4 minutes ago. He had not broken stride. He mapped the floor in the first 7 minutes the way he always mapped unfamiliar spaces. By walking the perimeter first, then the major arteries, then the smaller passages between rooms. It was not something he thought about consciously anymore. It was something his body did the way other bodies take in a visual panorama, automatically, immediately, updating in real time as new information arrived. For conference rooms on the left side, glass-walled from what he could tell by the way sound reflected off them versus passing through. Executive suites behind keycard access on the right. He had confirmed this by the distinct and specific click of a different type of lock mechanism, heavier, spring-loaded, the kind installed when you want people to know access requires more than a standard badge. A break room somewhere at the 11 o'clock position from the elevator bank, burnt coffee, synthetic vanilla creamer, the low refrigerator hum, the dry warmth of a microwave that ran frequently. He built the floor in his mind the way an architect builds from blueprint to model, not by sketching but by stacking certainties on top of one another until the structure held. He stopped at the far end of the hallway when the voices reached him. They came from behind a door that was not fully closed, a 3-inch gap, he estimated, based on the angle of the sound, which was reaching him partially direct and partially reflected off the wall to his right. 2 voices. A woman's first, clipped and certain. "He is useful for the report. That is all we are using him for." A man's response, lower, less careful. "His family has been pushing for this placement for years. Let them have the optics win. He will never survive real power. These meetings aren't built for people like him." Zion stood without moving for 7 seconds. He counted them. The corridor around him was empty. The fluorescent lights hummed. Somewhere behind him, Darnell laughed at something the person he was speaking with had said, the kind of laugh that meant he was working. People like him. Zion turned the phrase over in his mind with the same deliberate attention he gave to every piece of information he collected. He did not feel the surge of anger that might have come in an earlier year. He was 28 now, and he had been hearing versions of that sentence his entire adult life, and he had learned, slowly, with significant effort, that the appropriate response to someone underestimating you was not to correct them. The appropriate response was to become precisely what they had decided you could not be, in the most visible way possible, in the room they had decided you did not belong in. He straightened his spine. He shifted his cane to his left hand. He turned in the direction of the executive suites. He was going to need to find that elevator. The carpet began exactly at the seam where the elevator lobby tile ended, and it absorbed everything: footsteps, air movement, the low ambient hum that every office building produced at its own particular frequency, the way a held breath absorbs sound. One moment, Zion's cane was tapping against polished concrete and returning echo. The next, it landed and returned nothing. The floor had gone silent beneath him. He stood still for a moment and simply listened to the new silence. This was not the 31st floor. He had pressed 32, or what he had believed was 32, because the elevator button panel on the south bank of lifts had no consistent tactile distinction between the two. 30 had a slightly raised edge. 31 had a smoother face. 32, it turned out, had a braille indicator that was present but positioned at a rotation that made it read as 33 unless you approached it from exactly the right angle. He had pressed the wrong button. He had arrived somewhere he had not been authorized to arrive. He took 3 steps forward and stopped again. The ceiling was lower here. He knew this not by reaching up but by the way sound fell. Higher ceilings create room for sound to travel upward before returning. Lower ones send it back faster and at a flatter angle. This ceiling was close. The walls were farther apart than on 31, meaning the corridor was wider, but the acoustic insulation in them was significantly denser. He could tell because even his voice, when he said a low and testing hello to the empty air, returned almost nothing. Like dropping a stone into still water and watching it sink without a ripple. He moved forward carefully. The cane found a desk. Long, low, unmanned, its surface cool and slightly dusty at the far right edge, the kind of dust that accumulates on things that aren't touched every day. A reception desk. Executive reception. He moved around it to the left and continued down the corridor. 2 offices on his left were dark. He could tell because no warmth came from them, and the air around their doors was flat and undisturbed in the way that unoccupied rooms always were. The 3rd office had its glass wall frosted, which he knew because the sound reflection off it was different, diffused rather than clean, scattered rather than returned in one coherent angle. And the 4th office, at the end of the corridor and to his right, had its door open. Not all the way, but enough. He stopped in the doorway. The room was occupied. He knew this with the same certainty he knew everything, not by sight, not by sound, but by that specific quality of inhabited silence. A room where a person is deliberately holding still has a different texture than an empty room. It is the difference between quiet and held quiet. One is the absence of sound. The other is the presence of someone choosing not to make any. This room held the second kind. Whoever was inside had been watching him since the elevator. "You're on the wrong floor," said a voice. Male. Measured. Somewhere between 30 and 35, Zion estimated, based on the tonal register and the particular way the consonants were shaped, not clipped, not soft but precise, the diction of someone who had been educated carefully and had then, over time, filed off the parts of that education that sounded like performance. The voice stayed close to its origin. It did not reach across the room. It did not need to. It was the voice of a man who expected the room to do the traveling. Zion did not step back. "I know." A pause. Clean and deliberate. "The elevator bank to your right will take you back to 31. "I'm mapping the floor," Zion said. "Not mapping my way back. Mapping the floor." The distinction was intentional, and the man in the room heard it because the next pause was a different quality entirely, longer and textured with something that was not quite surprise but was adjacent to it. "Mapping," the man said. Just the word. Repeated back not as mockery and not as question, but as the specific act of a person who was cataloging information and wanted more of it. "Acoustics," Zion said. He brought the cane to the baseboard at his left and tapped once. Clean, solid resonance, dense plaster, no hollow wall, 18 inches minimum. He angled his head slightly upward and spoke toward the ceiling, just a shade louder. "This floor has a different insulation grade than 31. The carpet is wool, not synthetic. It compresses differently under the cane tip and it holds temperature. The window at the far end of this corridor is floor-to-ceiling glass, north-facing, because the air coming off it runs about 4 degrees cooler than the walls. And this room specifically," he paused, just briefly, "has a leather chair to the right of the desk, a laptop open somewhere on the desk surface because I can feel the warm air it's pushing out, and the person sitting behind the desk is approximately 12 feet from the door, left of center, and has not moved since I stepped off the elevator." The silence that followed this was a third type entirely. Not the held quiet of a person choosing not to speak. Not the processing pause of someone absorbing information. Something new. The silence of a person who has just encountered something they were not fully prepared for, and who is intelligent enough to know it. "How do you map a room?" the man said, slowly, each word given its own weight. "That you've never seen." Zion turned his head toward the voice. His chin lifted slightly. Something in his face. Not a smile, not quite, but the faint settling of a person who has waited a long time to be asked the right question. Changed. "The same way I map people," he said. The breath the man across the room drew in was not controlled. It was the involuntary, sharp kind, the breath the body takes when something lands directly on a nerve the person didn't know was exposed. It was gone in an instant, folded back into composure so fast that anyone else in the room would have missed it entirely. Zion did not miss it. He stood in the open doorway of an office on the 32nd floor of Harmon Capital Consulting, perfectly still, his hand resting light on the door frame, and he waited. Because he had just said something true in a room full of a man who was used to asking the questions. And now the only thing left to find out was what a man like that did when the ground shifted under him without warning. 19 days. Zion had not been back to the 32nd floor. His badge still didn't open it. That had not changed, and no one had mentioned the incident, which was itself a kind of information. When a powerful person decides not to address something you did, it is never because they forgot. It is because they are deciding what to do with it. He had spent 19 days waiting to find out what that decision was, while simultaneously attending meetings on 31 that continued to be exactly what they had always been. Performances of inclusion that produced no actual change in anything. He had been asked to review a draft of their accessibility report. He had returned it with 47 annotations. 11 of them had been incorporated into the next version. The other 36 had been classified, in the revision notes, as aspirational. He kept going in anyway, every morning, because this was the room. This was where the decisions lived, even if the decisions being made right now were wrong ones, and being present for a wrong decision was still more useful than being absent for a right one. The Triplet brothers were a story that everyone at Harmon Capital told in fragments, the way you piece together something large from the parts of it you can access. Nobody had the whole picture because nobody had been allowed to. Casius, Elias, and Damon Vale. Casius ran infrastructure. Elias handled acquisitions. Damon controlled the legal architecture. They had inherited the holding company from their father, Reginald Vale, who had built it from a mid-size regional investment firm into a corporation with 12 subsidiary companies and a market presence in 4 countries. The gossip said the brothers did not like each other. The gossip also said the brothers moved like a single organism when the situation required it. Both things, in Zion's experience, were probably true. Families with that much history and that much money usually were fractured along old lines, unified by external threat. He had not spoken to Casius Vale since the office on 32. He had not expected to. The grocery store on a Wednesday afternoon was part of his regular routine. He went at the same time every week because Harmon's Fresh Market had a layout he had memorized completely and a staff rotation he could predict, which made it the most efficient stop in his week. He had 6 items in his basket. He was standing fourth in line. The fluorescent lights buzzed. The conveyor moved. And then the air at the front of the line changed, the way it always changed when a certain kind of person walked into a certain kind of space. He did not immediately recognize the voice. He heard it before he could place it. Low, controlled, careful, offering something that sounded like helplessness from a man whose body language, even translated through breath and weight distribution, communicated nothing remotely helpless. It was an odd combination, jarring in the specific way that things are jarring when 2 pieces of information don't match. Zion filed it and kept listening. The cashier, a young man today, voice tipping upward at the ends of his sentences, responded with the deference he used for people who made him nervous. There was something in the way he reached for the words. Too smooth, too accommodating, the verbal equivalent of stepping back and gesturing someone else forward. That only happened when the person you were stepping back from had a particular kind of gravity. The transaction stalled. The familiar shape of a manufactured problem settling into place. Zion moved forward and paid. His card tapped the reader. The machine approved it. The cashier exhaled. And in the moment after, as the silence opened up between the man at the register and the man who had just covered his groceries, Zion was already cataloging. Because he had heard those shoes before. Leather sole, hard heel, the gait of a man who had been educated in how to walk into rooms and had internalized it so completely it was now just how he moved. Heel down slightly heavier than the toe. Weight distributed a degree toward the left. Same pattern he had filed 19 days ago when he'd been standing in the doorway of an office on the 32nd floor. Same man. And then, just beneath and behind that recognition, the second sound arrived. And the third. He almost missed them. They were positioned well, far enough back not to cluster, close enough to remain within a normal conversational orbit. Different shoes, both pairs. One slightly heavier tread, one with the soft compression of a rubber composite sole. different weight distributions. But the spacing between all three, the exact geometry of the triangle they formed, two flanking and one at center, was not the geometry of strangers standing near each other. It was the geometry of people who had been in each other's physical company so long they had stopped thinking about it. They had done this before. The three of them. The interval between the first pair of footsteps and the second had a rhythm to it that wasn't accidental. Zion tracked it backward, 4 seconds of buffer, a lane and a half of distance, the kind of gap that read as unrelated to a casual observer but maintained line of sight to the register from 2 different angles. Not bodyguards. There was no tension in their stillness, no watchfulness. More like the natural formation of people who operated as a unit and had distributed themselves for maximum coverage without needing to discuss it. Brothers. 3 of them. Doing this together. He took the receipt from the cashier's outstretched hand, folded it once and put it in his pocket. And instead of turning toward the exit, he turned at a measured angle, not looking, just orienting, to the space directly behind the man at the register to his left. "You're not alone, are you?" he said. Quiet, certain. No one answered, but all 3 of them adjusted at once. Not a dramatic movement. Barely perceptible. 3 bodies making the small, involuntary recalibration that people make when something unexpected forces a response before their minds have told their bodies how to respond. A shift in weight. A breath drawn at the same moment across 3 separate people. A change in the quality of the silence around all of them, from neutral to active. The silence confirmed it. Zion stood at the checkout counter holding his receipt, and he understood, with the specific clarity of a man who had spent his entire life being underestimated in rooms built by other people, that he was standing in the center of something that had been constructed before he arrived. A test. Designed by people who were used to administering tests. And he had walked directly off the script they had written for him, and they were now improvising, and improvisation in people who were not used to it was always the most revealing thing they ever did. He waited. The silence stretched. And none of the 3 Vale brothers moved first. The 29th floor conference room was chosen deliberately. Zion knew this before the meeting started, because he always knew when a room had been selected for a reason. 32 was Casius Vale's floor, his territory, his architecture, his air pressure. 31 was where Zion had been installed in the managed way of someone being kept. In a designated space. 29 was neither. It was a neutral elevation chosen by a man who wanted to signal reason without giving up control, and who was sophisticated enough to understand that the gap between those 2 things was exactly the kind of gap that other people fell into without noticing. Zion noticed. He arrived 4 minutes before the scheduled time. He always arrived early to unfamiliar rooms so that he could spend that time building the layout before anyone else's presence complicated the acoustics. The conference room was large, he estimated 30 by 20, roughly, based on the time it took the hum of the ventilation system to complete a full pressure cycle. The table was long and positioned close to center, with a slight bias toward the window wall, which he identified by the lower temperature gradient running along the left side of the room and the faint ambient sound of the city, 40 stories below and muffled but present. The chairs were high-backed, well-made. The armrests had the density of solid hardwood rather than MDF, and the upholstery gave under his hand with the specific give of quality fabric, not synthetic. Someone had poured water into 2 glasses already. He could hear the condensation against the marble tabletop, a faint, intermittent tick as the temperature difference worked its way through the glass. He sat and folded his cane across his lap and waited. Casius Vale arrived 2 minutes after Zion. He walked the way he always walked. The heel-heavy tread, the leftward distribution, the controlled pace that communicated absolutely nothing about his internal state, which was itself a form of communication. He pulled out the chair directly across from Zion. Not at an angle. Directly. He sat without preamble. For 5 seconds, neither of them spoke. Zion went first. The accessibility infrastructure in this building has 14 structural failures. He heard Casius go still. That particular quality of full attention, when a person stops whatever minor physical restlessness normally accompanies their thinking and simply becomes present. The braille on the 12th floor, Zion continued, uses incorrect character spacing. The cell height is wrong and the intercell gap is inconsistent, which means any proficient reader moving at normal speed will misread at least 30% of the room designations. I can provide the exact spec variants if you want it, but the short version is that someone installed it using visual measurements instead of tactile ones. The elevator buttons on the south bank have no tactile differentiation between floors 30 and 31. I pressed the wrong button the first week I was here, which is how I ended up on your floor. I want to be clear, that was a malfunction, not curiosity. Your floor has the same problem on the buttons between 31 and 32. The ADA-compliant restroom on this floor and on 31 both have door handles with a torque resistance that exceeds the federal maximum by approximately 40%. That means anyone with limited grip strength, arthritis, carpal tunnel, limb difference, cannot open that door unassisted, which makes the ADA designation functionally fraudulent. The planters on 31's main corridor are positioned without any floor warning system. No textural change in the tile, no raised edge, nothing. I walked into one my first day. I kept walking because I wasn't going to make a scene about it. But a visitor who was less practiced at staying composed would have had a different experience. The building directory in the main lobby is mounted at 68 inches, calibrated for standing-sighted users, and has no audio component, no tactile index, nothing. He paused. That's 5. Do you want the other 9? The silence from the other side of the table was not the silence of a man who was offended. It was not defensive silence. It was the silence of someone absorbing a fully constructed argument presented without warning and deciding, as Zion could hear in the slow and measured way he was breathing, whether to deflect or engage. Casius Vale chose to engage. You documented all of this in 19 days. I documented it in the first 4 hours, Zion said. The first afternoon I was here. I spent the rest of the 19 days deciding whether to say anything about it, and to whom. What made you decide on me? Zion tilted his head slightly. I didn't decide on you. The grocery store did. The breath Casius drew in this time was not sharp, it was controlled, but the control was deliberate in a way that the earlier ones had not been. Like a lid being pressed down on something that wanted to come up. The grocery store was a test, Zion said. I know. You can say it. I am not going to pretend to be surprised that a man who runs the infrastructure division of a billion-dollar holding company constructed a scenario to evaluate the character of someone his firm was being pressured to employ. It is actually a reasonable thing to do. My objection is not to the intention. My objection is to what the choice of method says about your assumptions. Another silence. Longer. Then, what does it say? It says, Zion said, and he kept his voice even because this was important enough to deliver without heat, that you designed a test that assumed I would experience financial pressure as the most meaningful form of social stress. That producing money in a public moment would reveal something essential about my character. And that is a test built on a class assumption that someone brought in for what you people are calling optics must be economically precarious. I am not. I could have covered your groceries 6 times over and felt nothing. That is not what you were measuring. But the tool you chose to measure it with tells me what your starting image of me was. The quiet that followed this was the longest one yet. Zion heard Casius's chair shift, a small movement, a redistribution of weight, the physical response of a person whose internal framework is making adjustments in real time. Then what? Casius said carefully. Should I have tested? You already ran the real test, Zion said. On the 32nd floor. When I walked in and you didn't send me away. You sat there and you listened to me map a room I'd never been in, and then you asked me a real question. That was the test that mattered. The grocery store was theater. A pause so complete it felt like the room had stopped circulating air. Then Casius Vale said, in a voice that was still controlled but had shed something, some layer of performance that had been running underneath it. If I commissioned a full audit and restructured all 14, would it change your position on this engagement? Zion was quiet for a moment. Not because he didn't have an answer, because the answer was important enough to deliver precisely. That depends entirely, he said. On one condition. He heard Casius lean forward slightly. The armrest registered the shift. Only if you fix it, Zion said. When no one is watching. Not when the cameras were on. Not in time for the next CSR report. Not for the quarterly review or the investor meeting or the shareholder optics. When no one was watching. When there was no audience to perform accountability for, and the work still got done anyway. The room went absolutely still. Casius Vale did not answer. And in that long, weighted silence, a silence that held inside it the particular tension of a man who had spent his entire life performing for audiences being asked to do something without one. Zion understood that he had just said something that would take time to land fully. Maybe days, maybe longer, but it had landed. He could feel it the way he felt everything, not by sight but by the change in the air. By the way the room's texture shifted when something true entered it and the people inside it stopped pretending otherwise. Whatever this was, this arrangement, this test, this careful and complicated thing that had begun on the 32nd floor with an unanswered question and continued through a staged grocery store and arrived here, on the 29th floor of a building full of failures no one had bothered to fix. It was not finished. It had not even truly started yet. The contract was already printed when Zion arrived. That was the first thing he noticed. Not the chair being pulled out for him, not the glass of water that had been placed at the exact position where his hand would land when he reached for the table edge, not even the fact that this meeting was happening at all. What registered first was the sound the paper made when Casius slid it across the surface toward him. A clean, single push, no hesitation. The sound of a document that had been sitting in that spot long enough to be slightly warm from the room's ambient temperature. This contract had been prepared before Zion walked in. Before he had agreed to anything. Before the conversation they were supposedly here to have. It was either arrogance or certainty. And Zion had spent enough time in the company of powerful people to know that those two things were not always the same, and that distinguishing between them was often the most important read you could make in a room. He reached forward and let his fingertips rest on the edge of the document. He did not pick it up. He did not reach for the summary his assistant had already prepared and forwarded to him the night before, because Casius Vale did not need to know how thoroughly he had already reviewed everything. He let the silence sit for a moment while his hand remained flat on the paper. "You printed this before I confirmed," Zion said. "I printed it when I decided to offer it," Casius said. "Whether you confirmed was a separate question. Most people would wait for the confirmation before wasting the paper. I don't make offers contingent on outcomes I haven't decided yet," Casius said. "The offer was made. The paper was printed. What you chose to do with it was always going to be yours. There it was. Not arrogance. Certainty. The kind that was not indifferent to outcome." Zion could hear in the steadiness of Casius's voice that the outcome mattered, but that had separated itself from the anxiety of outcome, which was a different and considerably rarer thing. Zion lifted the contract. He ran his thumb along the top edge to locate the staple, then used it as an anchor point while his other hand moved across the text. He was not reading it in this moment. His version, the one his assistant had formatted in accessible type and emailed to him 48 hours ago, was already memorized in the places that mattered. He was doing something else. He was feeling what kind of document it was by how it had been built. Paper weight, margin width, the number of pages. 14 pages. Standard binding. No exhibit attachments yet, but tabs at the rear for them, which meant there were addenda being prepared. Real authority, Zion said. It was not a question. Project lead on the Accessibility Infrastructure Initiative, Casius said. Not advisory. Not consultative. Decision authority on vendor selection, implementation timeline, and compliance certification. You report to me. No committee approval required below the board level. Zion set the document back down. He heard his phone buzz once on the table beside him. He had placed it there face down when he arrived, screen off, just the haptic alert still running. He did not reach for it. He already knew what it was. He had told his uncle Darnell 3 days ago that this meeting was being scheduled, and Darnell had been calling at increasingly compressed intervals ever since, the calls growing shorter and more pointed each time, their content narrowing from advice to instruction to a single repeated phrase. Do not sign anything without the family attorney present. Which was reasonable counsel and also, Zion understood perfectly, a way of inserting another layer of control into a decision that belonged entirely to him. The phone buzzed again. He left it. The family is going to say it is too fast, Zion said. That the terms haven't been fully reviewed. That I am being rushed into a commitment before I understand what I am committing to. Is that what you think? Casius asked. I think the terms are fair, Zion said. I think the scope is real. And I think the fact that you built addendum tabs into a document you printed 2 days ago means you are already planning for the work to grow beyond the initial framework. He paused. My question is not about the contract. My question is about the three of you. The air in the room shifted slightly. Not a dramatic change. The kind of shift that happens when a man recalibrates what register of conversation he is in. My brothers are not party to this agreement, Casius said. I know that, Zion said. I want to know if they are opposed to it. A beat, longer than Casius's usual ones. Elias has concerns. Damon is neutral. I run infrastructure. What are Elias's concerns? Another pause. And this one, Zion noted, was not a thinking pause. It was the pause of a man deciding how honest to be. He thinks bringing in an outside consultant with direct authority over an internal initiative sets a precedent that weakens the division structure, Casius said. He thinks it looks like an admission that we couldn't solve this internally. He's not wrong that it sets a precedent, Zion said. No, Casius said. He's wrong about why that's a problem. Zion sat with that for a moment. He found, to his own mild surprise, that he believed it. His phone buzzed a third time. He picked it up, located the side button by touch, and held it down until the device powered off completely. He set it back on the table. Then he reached forward and picked up the contract. I will need a formatted, accessible version of the addenda when they are ready, he said. Not a scan. Actual formatted text. And I want it understood that accessible formatting is part of the standard document production process for this engagement. Not a special accommodation made per request. Done, Casius said immediately. No hesitation. Then I will need a pen, Zion said. Casius slid one across the table. Zion caught it clean, found the cap, removed it, located the signature line by the raised edge of the notary box, and signed his name in the clean, practiced script he had developed years ago for exactly these moments. The moments when the pen was being watched, and he refused to let the watching change anything about how he held it. He capped the pen and set it on the table. I don't want to be protected, Zion said. He was not looking at Casius. He was looking at the particular quality of stillness in the room, the kind that existed in the moment right after something irreversible. I want to be effective. The room was quiet for a long moment. Then Casius Vale said, I know the difference. And from somewhere down the corridor, through the closed conference room door, Zion heard a second set of footsteps pause and then continue on. Elias. He had been in the building. He had been close enough to know the meeting was happening. The question of whether Elias Vale would remain neutral, or whether Zion had just made an enemy on the floor above his own, was one that the contract in his hand could not answer. The vote was in 11 days, and the boardroom was already divided before anyone sat down. Zion knew this because he had been inside 3 separate conversations over the past 6 weeks that were not technically about the vote, but which had been, in the way that all conversations in corporate buildings eventually were, entirely about it. The accessibility initiative had moved from draft proposal to formal presentation to board review in a timeline that Casius had pushed through with the specific, deliberate force of a man who understood that institutional resistance grew the longer it had to organize. Move fast. Present the data. Make the vote happen before the opposition could build a coalition. It was a good strategy. It was also the reason Elias Vale had stopped speaking to his brother in anything other than formal email chains for the past 3 weeks. Zion had been inside every working session. He had sat at the long table in the 32nd floor conference room, Casius's floor, which now carried a different set of associations than it had 2 months ago. While the reforms were built piece by piece from the 14 failures, he had documented into a comprehensive structural initiative that touched every building in the Harmon Capital portfolio. Not just 31. Not just this address. Every property they held, in 4 states totaling 22 physical locations. When the scope had expanded beyond the original building, it had been Zion who proposed it, and Casius, who had gone quiet for exactly 8 seconds before saying, with the measured certainty that Zion had come to recognize as his most honest register, "Write it up." He had written it up. He had written 43 pages of it, with technical specifications, vendor assessments, implementation phasing, projected timelines, and cost-benefit analysis that incorporated not just the legal liability reduction from bringing all properties into full ADA compliance, but the market data on consumer patterns within the disability community. A spending demographic that represented, as Zion had laid out in Section 4 of the report, over $400 billion annually in the United States alone, the majority of which flowed toward businesses that had demonstrated genuine and functional accommodation rather than symbolic gesture. The report was precise. It was comprehensive. It was, Zion understood, the most important document he had ever written. And it was also, depending on how the next 11 days went, entirely useless. The investor who was threatening to pull funding was a man named Broderick Ashford. Old money. Second-generation wealth built on real estate and compounded through aggressive acquisition of smaller firms across the Southeast. He held 11% of the outstanding shares in the Harman Capital parent entity and had held them for 19 years, which gave him the particular confidence of a man who considered his presence in a room a form of argument in itself. He was not, Zion had concluded after listening to 3 conference calls on which Ashford spoke and Casius responded with the controlled patience of a man who had not yet decided which fight to pick, someone who was against accessibility on principle. He was against it as a line item. He was against the cost of it appearing in a quarterly report before the market had demonstrated that the expense would be recovered. He was the kind of man who believed that justice was fine in theory but had to justify itself in a spreadsheet before it could be acted on, and who had spent so many years in rooms where that view went unchallenged that he had confused it for wisdom. Zion was going to have to be in that boardroom. He had known this for 2 weeks. He had not said it to Casius because Casius already knew it and was working up to saying it himself, and Zion had learned that there were certain conversations that needed to arrive in their own time or they arrived wrong. He let Casius work up to it. On a Tuesday evening, in the conference room at 8:43 in the evening, Zion tracked the time by the building's shift in ambient sound when the cleaning staff finished and the HVAC shifted to its overnight cycle. Casius said, "The board is going to want to hear from the project lead directly." "I know," Zion said. A pause. "Ashford is going to be there. I know that too." "He will not be respectful," Casius said. The words were plain and direct, which Zion appreciated. No softening. No performing reassurance. Just the truth. "He rarely is," Zion said. "That is fine. Disrespect is information. I have always been able to work with information." Another pause. Longer, and textured with something that Zion was still learning to name. It was not admiration, not exactly. It was something quieter and more specific than that. The feeling of a person who has been watching someone operate under sustained pressure and has slowly, incrementally, stopped wondering if they were capable and started simply watching what they would do next. "There is one more thing," Casius said. Zion waited. "Elias will be in the room." The thing about Casius Vale was that Zion had encountered him twice in 6 weeks and both times had come away with the same red. A man who was genuinely intelligent and genuinely threatened, which was a more difficult combination than either quality on its own. Elias did not dislike Zion. He disliked what Zion's presence represented. The external confirmation that something inside the structure needed fixing, which read to Elias as an indictment of the years he had been inside the structure without fixing it. It was not logical. Most of the things that drove people in rooms like this were not logical. But they were real, and real things had to be managed whether they were logical or not. "How is Damon?" Zion asked. A beat. Still neutral. "But he's been asking questions about the consumer market data in Section 4 of your report." "That means he's read it," Zion said. "That means he's read it," Casius confirmed. The late-night working session continued for another 2 hours. The overhead lights in the conference room had been on so long that the temperature near the ceiling was measurably warmer than near the table. Zion tracked this by the difference in the air that reached him when the ventilation cycled versus when it paused. Outside, the city had gone to its overnight frequency, the particular urban quiet that was not silence but was a full register lower than the daytime sound. At 10:51, Casius said, The marble in the lobby renovation. Zion lifted his head. The original budget spec called for composite flooring, Casius said. For cost, I changed it to marble. The accessible tactile pathway is being inlaid directly into the marble using brushed brass strip. It's a navigation guide for cane users and a visual contrast guide for low-vision visitors. It runs from the main entrance to the elevator bank to the reception desk. The contractor said it was possible but unusual. I told him unusual was fine. The cost difference is $14,000. Zion was quiet for a moment. You did that without telling me, he said. You told me to fix things when no one was watching, Casius said. I did not want to tell you about it. I wanted to do it. The room was very still. Not the managed stillness of two professionals inside a working session. Something different. Something that had been accumulating in the air of these late-night rooms for 6 weeks and had just found its shape. Zion said carefully, if marble is affordable, then dignity is mandatory. There was a silence. Say that again, Casius said. If this company can afford marble in its lobby, Zion said, then the dignity of every person who walks through that lobby is not a line item. It is mandatory. That is what you are saying when you choose the brass inlay. That is the argument you make to the board. Another silence. Longer. That is the argument I make to the board, Casius said slowly, as if he was building the structure of it in his mind while the words came out. 11 days. The vote was in 11 days. And Broderick Ashford did not yet know that the man presenting the case against him had spent his entire life learning to win arguments in rooms that were not built for him. The shareholder meeting was held on the 41st floor, in a room that Zion had never been in before and that announced itself to him, the moment the elevator doors opened, as the largest and most formally arranged space in the building. He knew it by the echo. The ceiling was high. Cathedral high by corporate standards, 12 feet at minimum, and the walls were far enough apart that his footsteps, even across the dense carpet they had installed for acoustic management, returned to him at a distance that told him the room could seat between 80 and 120 people. He had arrived 12 minutes early. The room was already partially filled. He could hear the low, continuous murmur of pre-meeting conversation. The specific register of professionals who were speaking to each other across rows, across aisles, keeping their voices at a volume that communicated they were calm and that communicated nothing else about how they actually felt. Casius met him 3 steps past the elevator. Not at the door, not at the front of the room, but at the precise midpoint between the two, which Zion recognized as a deliberate choice. Close enough to guide without being in front. Far enough from the entrance that the entry itself was Zion's alone. Ashford is in the 3rd row, Casius said quietly, falling into step beside him. Center. He has 2 associates with him. Who is chairing? Langford. He's fair. He will not intervene in exchanges unless someone violates procedure. I won't need him to intervene, Zion said. They moved to the front of the room. Zion located his chair by the sound of its specific position relative to the table. The table here was not round like a working session table but long and presentation-oriented, with the presenter position at the far end, facing the audience. He found his chair, confirmed its placement with one hand, set his cane against the table edge in the position he always used, and sat. Casius Vale was somewhere in the room. Zion had heard him the moment the elevator opened. The Vales moved with a consistency that made them identifiable by sound in the same way certain instruments are identifiable by tone. Elias was at the far right, near the window wall. Damon was somewhere in the center-left section. Neither of them was at the front of the room. The meeting began at precisely 9 o'clock. Chairman Langford, a man with a slow, deliberate voice and the cadence of someone who had been running formal proceedings for a very long time, opened with the standard board protocols, the agenda confirmation, and the disclosure statement. Casius presented the initiative summary in 11 minutes. Tight, data-dense, and structured the way Zion had helped him structure it. Lead with the liability exposure, move to the market opportunity, close with the moral framework. In that order. Because the people in this room would resist the moral argument if it came first, but they would be unable to dismiss it once the financial case had already landed. The room's atmosphere shifted in small but trackable ways during the presentation. Zion listened for it. The murmur dropped. The chair adjustments slowed. People settling rather than restless, which meant attention was being paid. Two people on his left had stopped the quiet note-taking shuffle that signaled they were waiting for something to write down, which meant they had found it. One person in the back, likely a junior associate, had begun typing at a rate that indicated verbatim capture. The content was landing. Then Broderick Ashford stood up without waiting for the question period. Chairman Langford said, "Mr. Ashford, the floor opens for questions in." "I'll take my time now, Langford, if it's all the same." Ashford's voice was deep and unhurried, the voice of a man who had interrupted proceedings before and found no meaningful consequence. He did not project aggressively. He simply projected the way people do when they have never been told their volume was unwelcome. "I want to address the consultant directly." The room went quiet in a way that was different from the previous quiet. This was the particular stillness of people who sensed a confrontation and were deciding whether to look at the person being targeted or look away from him. "Go ahead," Zion said. Ashford's voice located itself at the third row, center, exactly where Casius had said. "You were brought into this company 6 weeks ago to advise on accessibility. In 6 weeks, you have expanded a 14-item building checklist into a 43-page initiative covering 22 properties across 4 states, with a projected implementation cost of $8.7 million over 3 years. Pause for effect. I want to know how a man who has been inside this company for 6 weeks has the authority to make a 43-page argument for spending nearly $9 million of shareholder money." "He has the authority," Zion said, before the question's rhetorical pause had finished closing, "because it was given to him in writing by the division head with board-level sign-off on the scope of the engagement. The authority question was settled before I wrote the first page. The question you are actually asking, Mr. Ashford, is whether you believe the argument is worth $9 million. That is a different question, and I am happy to answer it." A small, almost imperceptible movement in the audience. 3 people near the aisle shifted in their chairs. Someone toward the back stopped typing. Ashford's voice tightened slightly. "Not enough for most people to hear, but enough. You're a compliance consultant, not a financial strategist." Section 4 of the report, Zion said, contains a market analysis of consumer spending patterns within the disability community in the United States. That community represents 61 million Americans and accounts for over $480 billion in annual discretionary spending. The companies that have demonstrated genuine functional accessibility, not symbolic, not checkbox, capture a disproportionate share of that spend because that community has a very low tolerance for performative accommodation and a very high loyalty rate to businesses that actually serve them. The projected cost of this initiative over 3 years is $8.7 million. The projected revenue expansion, modeled conservatively using accessible business case studies from comparable portfolio firms, is between $42 and $67 million over the same period. I did not write a compliance document. I wrote a growth strategy. The room was completely still. Ashford said, "You're using emotional data to sell a financial argument." "I'm using financial data," Zion said, "to make a financial argument. If the data produces an emotional response in the room, that is because the data concerns people. Most of the best financial arguments do." Ashford's chair shifted. He was deciding whether to continue. Zion waited. He had learned, over many years in many rooms, that the most important thing to do after landing something true was to stop talking and let the room decide what to do with it. "The numbers in Section 4, said a voice from the center left. Deliberate, measured, familiar tonal architecture. Damon Vale, who had been silent for the entire meeting. "I reviewed them independently. The modeling is conservative. If anything, the revenue projection in the report undersells the retention curve on the accessibility loyal consumer segment." The room shifted again. Not physically, but something in its temperature changed. The specific change that happens when the balance of a conversation tips and everyone in the room senses it simultaneously. Ashford said nothing. Chairman Langford said, "We will move to a vote at the conclusion of the comment period. Are there additional items from the floor? There were not. The vote was called. And then, before the results were announced, before the room had finished its collective recalibration from the exchange that had just happened inside it, a notification began moving through the row of associates along the back wall. One of them whispered something to a colleague, then to another. Then one of them leaned forward and passed a folded note toward the front of the room. The way notes got passed in boardrooms when someone received information they had not expected and did not know what to do with publicly. The note reached Chairman Langford. He read it. His chair shifted. "We will recess for 30 minutes, Langford said. "Before the vote is recorded. No explanation. No reason given." Zion sat very still at the front of the room and listened to the sound of 60 people wondering why. The memo had been leaked at 7:42 in the morning, 16 minutes before the shareholder meeting opened. Zion didn't learn this until the recess, when Casius appeared at his side in the room side corridor and said, without preamble, "Someone on the administrative team released the preliminary compliance audit internally before the vote." It went to every senior employee email in the building. All 22 locations. Zion turned his head slightly toward him. "Which sections?" "All of it," Casius said. "The full 43 pages, with the executive summary highlighted." A pause. "The market is reacting. Positively. The stock is up 2.5 points since 9 o'clock. Zion was quiet for a moment. "Who leaked it?" Another pause. Longer. The quality of Casius's silence in this moment was different from his usual measured ones. It was not a thinking pause. It was the pause of someone who had already formed a conclusion and was deciding what to do with it. "The release came from the administrative account attached to the 32nd floor," Casius said. Zion absorbed that. The 32nd floor was Casius's floor, his administrative account. Which meant either someone with access to that floor had done it, or Casius had done it himself and was now telling Zion while maintaining the specific quality of voice that belonged to a man who was being honest about something complicated. "The timing would have been deliberate," Zion said. "Yes," Casius said. "Before the vote, but after the market opened." "Yes, so that the market reaction would be visible in the room before the results were recorded." A beat. "Yes." Zion straightened the folder in his hands. He had brought one, a physical reference copy of the report, more for the weight of it than for any need to consult it. He set it flat on the corridor table beside him. "Then the vote is going to pass," Zion said. It did. The full structural compliance initiative was approved by an 11-3 board margin. Broderick Ashford voted against. His 2 associates voted against. Every other voting member of the board voted in favor, including, in a result that produced a quiet that lasted a full 4 seconds in the room, Casius Vale. Zion heard the vote count read aloud and heard the room's response to it. Not applause, not cheering, because these were not people who applauded in boardrooms regardless of outcome. What happened was a specific quality of collective stillness, the kind that exists when a room of people has just watched something go differently than at least half of them expected, and they are each privately adjusting to the new landscape. The market continued to respond. By 2 o'clock, the shares were up 4 points. By 4 o'clock, 2 financial publications had run brief items on the initiative, both framing it as a forward-looking ESG move by a mid-size holding company that had previously been unremarkable on accessibility metrics. Neither article mentioned Zion by name. One mentioned a new consulting engagement focused on structural compliance. The other attributed the initiative to internal leadership. Both descriptions were, in their own way, accurate. In the weeks that followed, the work began. Not the announcement of the work itself. Vendors were selected through a process that Zion ran with the same rigor he had applied to every other aspect of the engagement. 5 bids per category. Reference checks that included actual disabled users of each vendor's previous installations. Site visits to 3 comparable properties where they had done comparable work. He made decisions. Real decisions with real authority, in rooms where the people around him had initially been uncertain how to treat someone who was both blind and in charge, and who had resolved that uncertainty over the first 2 weeks by watching what happened when they did what he recommended. The decisions were good, the timelines were met, and the work advanced. The brass tactile pathway in the lobby went in first. Zion walked it on the day of installation. The contractor waited without being asked, and Zion moved along the inlaid strip from the main entrance to the elevator bank to the reception desk. His cane tip tracing the brass edge, the temperature of the metal faintly different from the marble on either side. It worked exactly as designed. He said so. The contractor, a man named Terrence who had been in construction for 22 years and had never installed a tactile navigation system before this project, asked what it felt like to use. Zion considered the question. It was not a question he was usually asked. Like moving through a building that was built knowing I would come, he said. Terrence was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I'm going to remember that. Casius Vale appeared in the break room on 31 on a Wednesday afternoon in the third week of implementation. Zion heard him before he saw him, or rather, before the people around Zion registered him and produced the specific shift in conversational register that happened when an executive entered a space where people were off-duty. He sat down across from Zion without being invited and said nothing for long enough that Zion stopped pretending to be interested in his coffee. The Section 4 data, Elias said finally. Where did you source the consumer loyalty modeling? Johns Hopkins and Nielsen combined, Zion said. The Disability Market Segment Studies from 2019 and 2022, cross-referenced with 3 proprietary retail datasets I licensed for the engagement. A pause. I had our research team verify the methodology independently. I know, Zion said. Damon mentioned it in the boardroom. Another pause. He did. Silence. You were right about the scope, Elias said. The words came out with the particular flatness of someone who had rehearsed them enough to get them out, but not enough to make them comfortable. The initiative should have been portfolio-wide from the beginning. We should have done this 5 years ago. Yes, Zion said simply. I opposed the engagement because I thought it was optics with a title attached, Elias said. I know that too, Zion said. Most people did. A pause. Most people were wrong. Most people usually are, Zion said. The useful thing is what happens after. Casius Vale did not respond to that immediately, but when he stood to leave, he paused at the break room door for a moment. A long, specific pause, the kind that meant something was being decided, and then said, Casius has been different since this started. In the way he runs meetings, the way he talks to people. Another pause. I don't know how you did that, but it matters. He left. Zion sat with that for a long moment, with his coffee going cold in his hands and the break room's fluorescent light buzzing at its familiar pitch above him. And later that evening, when Casius arrived at the 31st floor at 6:40, which was later than usual but not as late as the night sessions had run during the height of the initiative, he stopped in the doorway of the conference room where Zion was finishing the final section of the Phase 2 vendor report and said, I owe you an apology. Zion did not look up from what he was doing. For the grocery store. For the grocery store, Casius confirmed. And for what the grocery store said about what I assumed before I understood what I was looking at. He came into the room and sat down, not across from Zion where he usually sat in working sessions, but to his left, the position of a person who is sitting beside rather than opposite. I knew within 30 seconds that you were not what I had been told to expect. I had already been told by 3 different people that this engagement was a PR arrangement and that you were part of it. By the time you came off that elevator onto my floor, I had already seen enough to know that was wrong. The grocery store happened 2 weeks later. I know, Zion said. I wanted to know who you were outside a corporate building, Casius said. I wanted to know what you did when there was no professional context. No performance. I know what you wanted, Zion said. I told you at the time. A pause. You did. And you were right. Another pause, different in quality. The apology is not for the intention. The apology is for the fact that I ran a test you did not consent to, in a space that belonged to both of us, because I was more comfortable with the scenario I controlled than with the uncertainty of simply introducing myself. Zion was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, I knew. The words landed in the room between them the way the right thing said at the right time always lands, completely, and with a weight that had nothing to do with volume. From the grocery store? Casius asked. From the elevator, Zion said. from the floor where the carpet started. The silence that followed was not the managed silence of two people managing a professional dynamic. It was the different silence of two people who had just confirmed something they had both already known, and who were now inside the particular stillness that exists on the other side of that confirmation, quiet, certain, and moving towards something. And somewhere in the building below them, across 22 properties in 4 states, people were beginning to walk through spaces that had been rebuilt to know they would come. He heard Casius before the knock. Zion had been in his apartment for 2 hours, which was unusual only in that the apartment had felt different since the vote. Quieter in a specific way, the way spaces feel after something in them has been resolved. He had made tea. He had sat at the kitchen table with the radio on low, a jazz station that ran late into the night without commercial interruption, and he had done the thing he rarely let himself do in the middle of a working engagement. Nothing. He sat and listened to the music and let the last 4 months run through him in the way that experiences do when you finally stop moving fast enough for them to catch up. The building's elevator ran at a particular frequency. He had cataloged it within his first week of living here the same way he cataloged everything, not by deciding to but by paying attention until the information organized itself. The elevator on this floor took 12 seconds. From the lobby, the hallway outside his door was carpeted from the elevator to the fire stairwell, which meant footsteps were muffled but not silent, and Zion could usually identify a person's approach by the interval between their steps and the particular way their weight shifted at the moment they turned from the corridor toward his door. He heard the footsteps stop outside his apartment at 10:47 in the evening. They did not approach directly. They arrived at the correct distance from his door and then stopped, and they stayed stopped for long enough, 14 seconds, which Zion counted without intending to, that he understood the person outside was not knocking because they were not yet ready to. He heard the very faint and almost imperceptible sound of a breath being organized, the kind of breath that is taken before something that matters. Then a pause. Then the breath again. He set his tea down. He crossed the apartment without his cane. He did not use it in spaces he had built from the inside out, spaces that existed in his mind as a complete and navigable structure, every surface and corner and the exact depth of each step accounted for. He reached the door and stood with his hand not yet on the handle, and he listened to the quality of the presence on the other side of it. It was Casius. He had known it was Casius before the elevator arrived at this floor. He had known by the weight distribution in the footsteps and the particular interval of the approach and, if he was being fully honest with himself, by something else, something less precise and more foundational, the way you know certain things not because you have analyzed them into knowing but because your body arrived at the answer before your mind got involved. The thing about Casius Vale was that he was a man who had spent his entire adult life in rooms where he held the power, and who had learned slowly over the course of the past 4 months in the specific and irreversible way that real learning works, that holding power and understanding it were different things, and that the gap between them was a place where you could spend your whole life standing without ever knowing you were in it. He had changed. Not dramatically. Not in the way of a person who has had a revelation and rebuilt themselves around it. In the quieter way, the way of a person who has been in the company of someone honest for long enough that honesty starts to feel less like a challenge and more like the most useful available tool. He asked different questions in meetings now. He listened in a way that was not strategic. He had installed the brass inlay without telling Zion, not for the credit of telling him, but because the work had become the point. Zion opened the door. Casius was standing in the hallway with no briefcase, no folder, nothing in his hands at all, which was unusual for a man who almost always carried something that communicated purposefulness. He was wearing the kind of clothing that said he had not come from the office. A dark jacket, not a suit jacket, and no tie, which Zion identified by the absence of the faint rustle that Casius's ties made when he adjusted them during long meetings. He was standing at the exact right distance from the door, not too close the way people stood who were already beginning to push their way into a space, but not too far back the way people stood who were uncertain they had been invited. He had not spoken yet. Zion had opened the door and he had not yet spoken, and he did not immediately fill the silence with sound, which was one of the things that Zion had come to find. Not comforting exactly, but right. Most people filled silences because they were afraid of them. Casius sat in silences because he was deciding what to do with them. "I'm not here to test you," Casius said. His voice was at its lowest register, the one he used when the room was small and there was no one else to perform for. I rehearsed something different on the way here. I had a version of this that was more structured. I've been standing out here long enough that I decided the structured version was wrong. Zion said nothing. He waited. I want to say something true, Casius said. Without making it into a presentation. The hallway was quiet. The jazz station in Zion's apartment, audible now through the open door, ran a long piano passage through the open space between them. You walked into my building as something my family and my board and 3 separate people told me was a transaction, Casius said. A name on a report. A compliance placeholder with a title attached. And in 4 months you made the building better and the work more honest, and 3 of the most difficult conversations I have had in the last decade happen in rooms where neither of us had the advantage. You never needed me to change the room for you. You changed it yourself. Every time. He stopped. Zion could hear him choosing the next words with the same care that he gave to everything that actually mattered to him. I have been trying to figure out when I stopped thinking of this as a professional engagement, Casius said. And I keep landing on the same moment. You were on the phone with a vendor on a Thursday afternoon in the conference room, and the vendor said something dismissive about the timeline, and you came back at him with 3 sentences of technical code reference and projected implementation data that made him go completely quiet. And I was standing in the doorway and I watched the way you did it. Not angry, not proving anything, just precise and certain and entirely unbothered by the fact that he had underestimated you. And I thought, I want to be in the company of this person for a long time. Not in conference rooms. Not on contracts. The piano passage continued through the open door. Zion stood in the doorway of his own apartment, with the music behind him and the hallway in front of him and Casius Vale standing at exactly the right distance, and he felt the specific quality of a moment that had been building for a long time arriving at the exact shape it was always going to take. I'm not here to test you, Casius said again, quieter. I'm here to choose you. Zion reached forward and found the doorframe with his right hand. He held it for a moment, solid, familiar, anchoring. Then he stepped back, making room, not as a gesture, not as a performance of openness, but in the way that a person does when they have decided. Not because they were convinced, but because they arrived, through 4 months of precision and honesty and a brass inlay that was installed on a Tuesday morning when no one was watching, that the person in the hallway had earned the threshold. The door was open. The music came through. No grand gesture. No crowd. No ceremony. Just the specific, earned stillness of 2 people who had tested each other without knowing they were doing it, and had come out on the same side. And in 22 buildings across 4 states, people were walking through spaces that finally knew them. That is where the story lands. Not in a ballroom. Not in a headline. In a hallway at 10:47 at night with the door open and the music playing, and 2 people standing at the threshold of something that had been built. Piece by piece, decision by decision, brass strip by brass strip to last. If this story moved something in you, if you saw yourself in Zion's precision or Casius's slow and deliberate change, then this is your moment. Drop a comment below and tell me which scene hit you the hardest. Was it the grocery store? The boardroom? That hallway? Your voice in the comments is what keeps stories like this alive, and every one of them gets read. Subscribe to this channel and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a story that inspires. Stories about real power, real change, and the people who build both without asking for permission. Share this with someone who needs to hear it today. And if you have a story of your own, a moment when you were underestimated, when you changed a room just by walking into it honestly, put it in the comments. You might just inspire the next story told on this channel.